Good afternoon. My name is Steph Kerswell. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Matilda Centre for Research in Mental Health and Substance Use, and I'm also the project lead for Cracks in the Ice. I'm really excited to welcome you to today's Cracks in the Ice webinar. So welcome. Before we begin our webinar, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. I'm currently on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, home to the beautiful Gadi trees, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I also would like to further acknowledge the traditional owners of the countries on which you are on today and pay respect to their elders past and present. And also acknowledge any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are amongst us today. So for those of you who haven't been to a Cracks on the Ice webinar before, today's presentation is one in a series of webinars that we run as part of the Cracks in the Ice project. So if you haven't already seen the webinar website, I would encourage you to visit cracksinttheice.org.au and we welcome any comments or questions. I realise my colleague is talking very loudly next door, so hopefully there's not too much background noise coming through. But before I introduce you to today's speaker, I just wanted to let you know that you are participants in this webinar. So you are in listen-only mode, and that means that we can't see or hear you, but you will notice that you have a Q&A button on your dashboard, and this is where you can type in any questions that you have through the webinar and send them to us. We'll also have a question and answer section at the end of our webinar today. And we'll also be making the recording of the session today available via the Cracks in the Ice website. So that's all our kind of housekeeping for today. So now I'm excited to introduce today's speaker, who is Dr. Nick Kerswell. And I've already said that at least once I'm going to get our last names mixed up because my last name is Kershaw, so I apologise in advance. But Nick is a clinical psychologist and the clinical research and implementation specialist at Lives Lived Well, which is based in Brisbane, Queensland. And his work focuses on practice-embedded research within alcohol and other drug treatment services, with a particular interest in impulsivity, co-occurring conditions, and implementation science. And Nick's recent research has focused on examining alcohol and other drug moderators of the relationship between emotional states, impulsivity, and problematic gambling. So thank you so much for joining us today, Nick. I'm really looking forward to this interesting session, and I'm going to hand over to you now.
Great. Thank you so much, Steph. And yeah, really a pleasure to spend the morning with you all. I say morning because I'm on Brisbane time, so we're still... Now, bear with me a moment. I just need to figure out sharing the presentation. All right.
Looks
Is that
great.
looking good? Fantastic. So yes. So yeah, like I said, a pleasure to be joining you today. What will we be talking about? With the very jazzy title there, Amped Up Methamphetamine and Emotional Urgency as Conditional Amplifiers of Gambling in a Treatment-Seeking Population. So yeah, in short, we'll be talking about how various substances, but predominantly methamphetamine, interacts with gambling behavior and gambling harm, gambling risks. As Steph mentioned, I'm a clinical psychologist by trade and I have the pleasure to work at Lives Live Well. And just a bit on disclosure of interests, I have none to declare. My role is entirely funded by Lives Live Well, and I don't receive any money from industry. I'd like to thank Steph for the acknowledgement of country. Myself, I'm joining you today from Yagara and Turrbal lands here at Bowen Hills in Brisbane, and that's from where I'll pay my respects to elders past, present, and leaders emerging. I think also particularly important, especially against the backdrop of what I'll be presenting on today, to recognize, the contribution of people with lived and living experience, which is really the reason for the work that we do here at Lives Live Well, and to acknowledge their contribution to, the work that we do. And additional to that, to recognize those with a history of service in our armed forces and the sacrifices inherent to that very particular, calling. And just as an organization, we're one that's very, very committed to diversity and inclusion, both for our workforce and, of course, for the communities and peoples, that we serve through the services that we provide. This one I'd like to speak to just for context as much as anything. For those of you who maybe aren't so familiar with Lives of Well, we're perhaps best known as a provider of alcohol and other drug services, though we do quite a bit in the mental health space as well. And we run a gambling service across our Queensland-based services. So unfortunately, we're not funded for New South Wales or Adelaide, where we have a small but lovely presence down there with our families and veterans wellbeing hub as well, which launched a bit more recently. But yeah, that's a bit of the scope of who we are. So we're very active in the regions as well. Drawn straight from our most recent annual report, which was recently published, who we support, a lot of people. And again, to sort of give the scope of the services that we do, we provide services across about 10 residential services for alcohol and other drug support, and a broad array of community-based services. And our gambling counsellors, like I said, based out of Queensland, do quite a lot of outreach to people all across the state. In addition to who we support, a really important part, and it'll really set sort of the background for a lot of what we'll talk about today, is what we measure. And we make very extensive use as an organization around data, not for the sake of collecting data, not just sort of to tick boxes and to put it in a drawer somewhere or just to satisfy our funders. The reason that we use the measures that we use is that it's a really integral part of the support that we offer to people. And the reason that we're so thorough, debatable as to how thorough or maybe over thorough we might be, but we're nothing if not thorough, is that we have a really good picture of what's going on for people sort of across their mental well-being, their substance use, and various other things as well, certainly gambling being one of those. And of course, impulsivity, which is a bit of the special sauce that our particular set of outcome measures might have and that might not always be measured in all contexts. We'll certainly talk about that a little bit more today. Just to sort of very quickly walk through each of those, again, acknowledging some might be more or less familiar with some of these measures. We use the PHQ-9, the Patient Health Questionnaire, for a measure of depression symptoms. We use the GAD-7 in a similar sort of fashion for anxiety symptoms. The ATOP, which is an Australian product, which is lovely, is sort of a broad gauge of frequency and quantity around different types of substances, and also sort of a range of other sort of things that are going on in people's lives, and also their subjective quality of life. The WHO Assist really broadly looks at harms that people are experiencing around particular classes of substances. The PTSD screen is exactly what it sounds like, is a brief screener for trauma symptoms. The SUPS, don't ask me to explain the acronym, it's a bit out there, but is our short impulsive behavior scale. The PGSI, which we'll talk about quite a bit today, is the Problem Gambling Severity Index. And the last one there is the Patient Experience Questionnaire, because of course we're keenly interested to get feedback from the people that we're supporting about how we're doing and how we might make our services better. We'll touch more on these as we go along today. I just think useful to sort of set the scene at the outset about the scope of what we might be talking about and looking at as we go along. But a really critical thing, if we sort to focus on gambling now, is sort of looking at the broader Australian population and sort of what that looks like. Going to the data across Australia, about 1 in 100 Australians fall in that category on the PGSI around high-risk gambling. If we look more specifically at alcohol and other drug services, though, it looks quite different. In essence, it looks like this. It's 1 in 5 people seeking support for alcohol and other drugs. And of course, a really important part of that, though, is that not in all contexts are people's gambling behavior being asked about, or is treatment or support being offered around that, though. But that prevalence is really very important as we sort of continue on through today and sort of explore all that we might. So just to set a bit of a background, as we sort of touched on, that the co-occurring element of this is very common, that in essence, where you find one, you very often find the other. So more often than not, you're finding both together rather than one independently. And while there's various sort of percentages that are probably kicked around, that one that's very commonly cited there is about 57.5% in terms of that co-occurrence. And in addition to alcohol and other drug use, gambling harm very often co-occurs alongside mental health concerns, so depression and anxiety. As we've mentioned, there are more substance-related harms. and more broadly against the backdrop of impulsivity and emotional dysregulation, which is something we'll talk about quite a bit today. And I guess in essence, as people are sort of reporting more harms, more issues, more difficulties around gambling, that tends to sit against the backdrop of an overall more complex picture. In essence, it's rarely the case that where you find gambling, that you're not finding anything else. Not to say that that's unheard of, it just becomes increasingly less likely as the risks and harms around gambling climb. Now, today I'm not going to do a deep dive into theory. I'll leave it to other cleverer people than myself to contest that space. But just in brief, I thought it would be useful to touch on some of the sort of core theoretical perspectives around why people might experience difficulties around gambling, and for that matter, experience difficulties around alcohol and other drug use. You know, one of the sort of sets of theories around gambling, and particularly gambling harm, is that it's driven by, sort of people's thoughts, their beliefs, the sort of more cognitive models, if we want to use that somewhat fancy word. And that can sort of span a range of things, but at the core of it, sort of people's desire to win, it can be really, really fueled, really driven by the beliefs they have about gambling, both that maximize their perception that they're going to win and minimize their perception that they're going to lose. And of course, very often the beliefs that sit around this are quite distorted, to say the very least. For other people, it might be driven more by their need to assist them with regulating their emotions or coping with their mood, coping with distress, broadly speaking. And so in that sense, gambling might fulfill a slightly different function in that it provides relief from distress, negative emotional states, things of that nature. So in essence, more as a form of escape behavior rather than a desire to win or sort of chasing excitement. And that last one there is sort of more, perhaps a bit of a blend, but drawing on that focus on impulsivity, that, when people are engaged in gambling, in essence, the way their brain works is working differently because they're gambling. And so the way they make decisions might look quite different. And what we might observe is that there's an awful lot of overlap there between what we might see in the AOD space. That again, one of the many reasons that people might use alcohol and other drugs is that it's enjoyable, that it's inherently reinforcing, that they're getting something out of it. And that sort of reinforces and perpetuates, the use of that substance. So that's sort of more drawn toward, and again, very, very similarly to what we touched on with gambling, that it might equally be about getting away from, that people are experiencing distress, anxiety, depression, trauma, whatever it might be, these sort of unpleasant internal states. And so the various substances that people might use is really a way to sort of, reduce those experiences, to block them, get away from them, to avoid them, if you will. And again, similarly, probably as we would be aware that, when people are affected by substances, the way that they make their decisions might be quite different. And that sort of even further relates to the choices people make around continuing substance use as well. So I'm aware that's by no means exhaustive, but they're probably some of the core things that we might hold in mind as we go further. So in addition to that theoretical overlap, one of the things that we can observe is if we talk about harms, that the majority of the harms that people might experience are, again, substantially overlapped here. There are some that are probably considerably more specific to alcohol and other drugs. For example, infectious disease, overdose, and things of that nature are very, very unlikely to be experienced directly from gambling, and so probably are more AOD specific. But if you cast your eye over just about everything else that we've got there, they really are commonalities that are observable when people are experiencing harm related to gambling, just as much as harm relating to alcohol and other drugs. So in that sort of classic Venn diagram sense, those circles are almost completely overlapping one another. So let's talk a little bit more specifically now about that intersection, those overlapping circles, if we will, and how they might not just come together, but really this sort of question of might they feed into each other as well? In essence, that's what we mean by this term moderator. And as with that picture there with the dial sort of moving up and down, and almost one way you could think about a moderator, at least the way I understand it, is a bit like the dimmer switch on a light, that at different levels, it sort of turns the light up and down, sort of increases or decreases the intensity of it. And that's sort of the way that I'd sort of hold in mind as we're talking about stimulants here in particular. that, that might indeed be a powerful moderator of gambling behavior, thus gambling risk, and by extension, gambling harm. And something we see in the broad literature is that when we're thinking about substances broadly speaking and how they tie in with gambling, it really is that sort of broad class of stimulants that shows up most commonly. Now, of course, that is not to say that other, classes of substances, whether they be depressants, hallucinogens, or various other types and pathogens and everything else aside, are not featured in the gambling space. But it does seem that stimulants are the ones that present most commonly. And sort of further to that, the way that that shows up might look quite different depending on the level of gambling risk or gambling harm that people are reporting or experiencing. One of the things that's particularly interesting within this space is sort of the old chicken and egg argument of, which came first and what does that mean? What we can broadly observe, and again, by no means the absolute ironclad rule, is that generally speaking, gambling tends to precede, so come before the onset of stimulant use. And I guess what we take from that is that it's not always the case that gambling harm occurs downstream of substance use as a form of harm. I guess further to that, though, if people commence with gambling and then start to add substance use, particularly stimulant use, into the picture down the track, that might start to change the way they gamble. Their gambling behavior might start to shift, and all sorts of things might start to shift around that, talking about risk and harm there in particular. And this is where we get to thinking about, how do these sort of different substances, particularly stimulant type ones, act as potential moderators? And particularly how that might sort of tie in that sort of facet of impulsivity and urgency as another aspect of that. Now, I'm not going to go into a deep dive here into stimulants or methamphetamine for that matter. I imagine we're broadly familiar with, what that substance is and broadly how it works. But we are sort of aware that it increases arousal and energy, and particularly reward sensitivity. And I think if we're, considering those gambling theories from earlier, that might be of particular relevance here, sort of, sensitizing people to that perception that I can win here, and that's something that I can control, and there's perhaps unhelpful beliefs that might circle in that sort of space. Of course, equally and broadly speaking, when people are affected by substances, they tend not to make the best decisions that they might ever make in life. And if you think about, how that might tie in with gambling, it should be fairly apparent how that could be quite a risky business. Even in terms of the way that people might gamble, they might take more risks, bet more than they intend, and sort of various things around that while they're affected by drugs, particularly stimulants. Another aspect of that, of course, is that when people are using stimulants, very often their need for sleep is substantially diminished, if not, largely, blocked out, at least for a period of time. One thing we'd be aware of is that casinos and quote unquote gaming rooms, if you will, tend to operate either around the clock or to have very, very extended trading hours. Almost like they're creating a market for it. And I guess by way of this really sort of creates additional potential for people to experience additional harm. So we were interested to explore this a little bit more because there wasn't sort of nearly as much as we sort of hoped would be out there that sort of really unpacks this relationship, particularly looks at it through that lens of, how does substance use potentially act as a moderator? So given that we couldn't find it, we decided we'd go ahead and do it ourselves. So drawing on the broad data set that we have available within our organization, we sort of put a model together to see, how these various bits and pieces come together. Thinking about, how does people's mood, their depression and anxiety sort of feature in this? How do people respond to particular emotional states and the decisions or behaviors they might engage in around that, picture into that? And of course, the big one, how does substance use come into all this? And ultimately, how does that shape or change people's gambling behavior or the risks that they sort of experience around their gambling behavior? So if one is so inclined, we do have an article that we published from this work in the Journal of Gambling Issues. That is open access, so that's freely available to anyone. So feel free to look that up if you'd like to do some additional light reading. Talking about the methodology that we employed for this particular study, we collected 5,600 unique baseline outcome measures from clients who have accessed our various services. And we looked at the PHQ-9, so depression symptoms, GAD-7, anxiety, the WHO assist, so substance-related harms across a very broad array of different substance types. We looked at the subs for those different measures of impulsivity, and of course, gambling behavior around the PGSI. And we used good old SPSS and a hierarchical regression model and process model 14 from Hayes Process, which is probably a bit too nerdy. Anyway, I've touched on the subs a few times. Again, this is an interesting one because I'd never encountered it in my travels until I got involved with a research group a few years back. The good thing about this is while there's some pretty weird and out there language, like for example, I think if you were to ask most people on the street if they've ever heard of negative urgency, I think just about no one has heard of that term, and it's almost painfully academic. But the concept of it is one that we can probably relate to quite a lot, which is that when I feel bad, I don't like that. Kind of want rid of it. Probably is useful here, that word urgency, to sort of differentiate though, because like on the face of it, you could probably call that coping. That if I don't feel great and I want to feel different and I do something about it, if I do that skillfully and healthily, that's effective coping. Some of the ways that I might respond to that could be less skillful, I suppose. And it's also that element of urgency that I want it gone. I want it gone immediately. I want it to go now. And of course, if we think about substance use, that can very much be one way that that can be achieved, at least in the short term. Similarly, gambling, as we touched on earlier, can be a way that people try to regulate their emotions by engaging in gambling. So if negative urgency is getting away from unwanted internal experiences, positive urgency, I guess, is the flip side of that coin, wanting to heighten or extend, sort of more positive states, when people are in a kind of elevated mood, keeping the good times going and taking more risks when they're in that sort of state. Lack of perseverance, in a word, is procrastination. Lack of premeditation is more sort of not thinking ahead or acting really rashly, but not quite as emotionally driven. Possibly sensation seeking is literally what it says on the tin. It is sort of, that tendency for novelty and excitement, adrenaline chasing, all the sorts of stuff you'd expect that go with that term. So what did we find? So off the bat, both depression and anxiety were significant predictors of problem gambling in and of themselves. Probably not terribly surprising, but it did sort of support that model that some element of gambling behavior can be driven by, those unpleasant emotional states. Starting off with the categorization, we had a look at, where did these sort of people fall in those four broad categories of gambling. So about 44% were non-gamblers. So the majority of people don't gamble at all. Another 10% fell in the low risk category, about 17.5 in the moderate risk. Unfortunately, about 28.5 fell in the problem gambler category, so 8 and above on the PGSI. So that was a bit higher than the 20% that I reported a little bit earlier. So after that step, we looked at the hierarchical regression. We started sort of feeding more into the model. And the only substance that we found that was significantly associated with the WHO assist measures was methamphetamine, and for that matter, with the PGSI. So we effectively excluded everything else. From the subs, the only two things that we kept were the two urgency measures, both negative and positive urgency. So getting away from unpleasant emotions and wanting to heighten and extend the positive emotions. Now, talking about the process model, ultimately, this is what we created. Now, I'm not going to get into the sort of the statistics, the maths and all that sort of thing, because it's largely lost on me too. But in terms of making sense of it, we could see that there was a very, very strong relationship between depression and anxiety, just as an aside. So we kind of melded them together. Following on from that, we looked at, does those two forms of urgency help to explain the relationship between depression and anxiety and problem gambling? Turns out it does to a significant degree. And then the last bit we fed into it was, well, where do we put methamphetamine? And we fed it in as a moderator. So assuming all of that's in the mix, what happens if you add, or if it's absent for that matter too? Again, with that expectation that if you add that into the mix, particularly if people are more involved with that, and we used the WHO assist. So in essence, as we were measuring, as people are reporting more harms that they're experiencing around their methamphetamine use, how does that flow through to the gambling problems that they're reporting? And what we found, in essence, was that the more that people are reporting those methamphetamine-related harms, it turned out that they would be reporting a higher score on the PGSI, so reporting more problems that they're experiencing around gambling behavior as well. And that was true for both negative urgency and positive urgency. So we figure we're onto something here, that clearly methamphetamine and gambling have a very interesting relationship, and we should probably explore that a little bit further. So we went back for a second bite. We didn't just replicate what we'd already done. This time round, we were sort of interested to explore things, I guess, a little bit more broadly and get sort of the feel of what else does it look like? Where else does it show up? And what could be some of the other harms that people might be experiencing, but perhaps experiencing variably as a function of whether they do or don't, or how much, methamphetamine might be causing issues for them, for that matter. So we got a lot more data. This time round, we drew 18,782 unique baseline outcome measures. And while we're sort of on that topic, I might just jump ahead to the next slide. And I'm aware sort of like wall of text here, but really breaking it down, when it comes to primary drug of concern for people accessing our services, it's about a roughly 50-50 split between methamphetamine and alcohol. But a really important thing to note, at least for our service, likely true of others though, is that polysubstance use is really kind of normative. When it comes to alcohol, that's much more likely that that might be sort of like a single substance that people use, maybe with, say, tobacco as well. But very often, particularly if people are using or reporting that they use methamphetamine, there's a very, very good chance that they're using several other substances as well, just that methamphetamine is their sort of their primary substance. Because as we can see, other than cannabis, just about everything else is quite remote, if you will, in terms of being primary drug of concern, at least for clients accessing our services. If we look at the sort of breakdown, though, across those different gambling categories based on the PGSI, you can see at a glance that it's hugely variable. Like just at a glance, like for people who report methamphetamine as their primary drug of concern, only 35% report not involved in any sort of gambling, compared to 60% for people who reported cannabis as their primary drug of concern. I guess if we sort of jump over the middle there and come around to the problem gambler category, about 29% of people who reported methamphetamine as their primary drug of concern fell in that category. And if we look at some of those other stimulant sort of class types like cocaine, that was even higher at 30.6%. The only one that we couldn't really explain, and to this day I'm still sort of scratching my head about a bit, was heroin, with 27% of clients, who reported that as their primary drug of concern, falling in that problem gambler category. That one did seem a bit at odds with everything else, so I'm going to have to put a bit more thought into that one. So we break it down a little bit more. Really what we can observe with consistency though, is that when people are sort of using stimulants, predominantly, like we said, just in sort of that raw count, predominantly that is a methamphetamine story, at least for clients coming through our services, they're more likely to be also experiencing issues around gambling. And with some other substances, that was kind of the other way around. It actually made it a bit less likely, which again was an interesting finding in itself. What we find is that, this can sort of really vary across those different categories, and that particularly for these substances, the picture really becomes most pronounced when we're looking at that problem gambler category. So really it's sort of more at the pointy end of things. Now, once again, apologies in advance for the next slide, which is going to be another wall of text. So I'm going to really try and break it down, and we'll talk through this in a bit more detail as we go through in just a moment. But what we were interested in here is sort of looking at a bit of like categorization. So basically we did crosstabs. So we looked at people who either do or don't use methamphetamine specifically, and then across those different categories of gambling issues. So either non-gamblers, we molded low and moderate in together just to make it a little bit simpler, and then the problem gambler category as well. And again, right away, you can see that those groups aren't even close to being even in terms of count. That, in the problem gambler category, that we have 2,528 people who report using methamphetamine, whereas we have 631 who didn't report using methamphetamine, at least in the last year. Now, I'm not going to dwell too long on the numbers here because we'll talk through them in just a moment. But before we do, I want to bring impulsivity back into the picture. Because if I do jump back really quickly, that bit down there at the bottom with the subs, those are our four factors, those four flavors, if you will, of impulsivity and sort of what they show up as. And again, what we can observe is that our problem gambler category was significantly more elevated almost across the board on all these measures. In some respects, irrespective of whether methamphetamine is in the picture or not, it just is much more likely that it is almost definitionally looking at the distribution of those groups. Now, going to the, some of the theory again, what this gets us to thinking about is that, rather than necessarily having these two completely distinct pathways of sort of, being drawn towards excitement or wanting to get away from distress, it may well be both of these things because, again, the correlation between positive urgency and negative urgency is actually really quite high. And I guess what we're sort of taking away from this is that at different times in different mood states, people might be motivated differently in terms of the sort of behaviors they engage in and why they engage in them, even if at times the behavior itself might be the same thing, which of course in this instance might be to engage in gambling. Sometimes it might be to chase excitement, other times it might be to reduce distress. Either way, of course, there's the risk that people experience harms around that. Holding that for the moment, though, what we were interested to explore at this point was, well, we collect a lot of other measures, and we were really interested to explore, largely drawing from the ATOP here, across other life domains and sort of life factors, what are potential harms that people might be experiencing and experiencing differently? And back to that question of, is methamphetamine a potential moderator? So not just of interest, but at different levels, does it sort of amplify harm, hence amped up, as we sort of called it? So let's take a look across a range of things now and how that sort of shakes out in that mix. So one of the questions that ask is in the last period, have people reported driving under the influence of substances? And what we can see here is across those groups that it's really quite variable. For the people who reported not using methamphetamine and not gambling, it was as low as 24.5%. For our group who reported using methamphetamine and also falling in that problem gambler category, that jumped up as high as 42.3%. You can see almost across the line there that it's sort of a gradient upwards, to a degree rising as gambling, problems elevate. Further question on the ATOP asks about whether people have engaged in unprotected sex. And you can see that there's a huge degree of difference there between the first group there, no methamphetamine and non-gambler, through to our group reporting use of methamphetamine and falling in that problem gambler category from 18.8 up to 53.8. To be fair, and we'll touch on this a little bit more, this though is probably an example of where it seems at a glance that this is more a story about the impacts of using methamphetamine more than the impacts of gambling. That's like we'll unpack a little bit more soon. Similarly to this one here, where we're talking about, engage, this is a very specifically the question asked about sharing injecting equipment. So that being an unsafe injecting practice is very much a methamphetamine story more than a gambling story. And perhaps that's not particularly surprising. In terms of reporting self-harm, acknowledging those base rates are perhaps a little bit lower, but of course, given the significance of this worrying, all the same. But from that first group there being 8.4% through to our higher categories of gambling harm, which in this instance, irrespective of methamphetamine, were almost identical to each other, but quite a bit elevated there at nearly 16%. Talking about experiencing an overdose, so again, particularly worrying. This one here, we can see that it sort of marches fairly much in lockstep until we get to the higher category of gambling harm, where it starts to diverge a little bit more sharply, and we can perhaps see the impact of methamphetamine being that moderator there. This one was perhaps a bit more stark again. When it comes to people having experienced violence in the last period, we can really clearly see that divergence across all the different categories of gambling problems, that this is very much more the impact around being involved with methamphetamine. And perhaps a similar, though less pronounced relationship when it comes to also using violence in the last period. Another one that was fairly stark and pronounced, looking at the impact or people who have reported experiencing some degree of homelessness in the last period. The difference there in those two problem gambler categories between 16.4% for people who reported no use of methamphetamine, really skyrocketing up to nearly 38% for people who reported methamphetamine use, and falling in that problem gambler category in the last month is really quite striking. And the last measure that we looked at was whether people had reported having been arrested in the last month. Once again, we can see that there's that divergence there across those different categories, but particularly when there's methamphetamine use involved in the mix, that does seem to be considerably higher across those different categories of gambling. So while we've touched on this a little bit across that discussion, this was where we really wanted to ask the question, well, what's really going on here? Like, what's the story? Of course, any harm is of concern to us, and it's something that we want to be responding to and doing all that we can to minimize it. But we really sort of need to understand the complexities at play here. Like, at the core of it, is this more about gambling? Is this more about methamphetamine or other drug use? Or is this a story of where those two things come together to particularly amplify harm that people might be experiencing? So we did a bit of fancy math and whatnot, and we looked at it a little bit more closely. And for some measures we touched on a little bit earlier, it was probably a lot more about methamphetamine than it was gambling or anything else. The most prominent example there is probably fairly obvious when it comes to unsafe injecting practices. That is very much looking at, methamphetamine involvement and has very little to do with gambling. And, that's perhaps not too surprising. Some of the other measures as well, though, and sometimes a little bit more surprising, seem to be much more about the impact of methamphetamine more than gambling. As we sort of noted earlier, that the group who had some level of methamphetamine involvement when it came to homelessness was sharply higher compared to the group who did not. And it was broadly consistent across those different levels of the PGSI. So we didn't see, a huge degree of variance there. For others, though, there was very much this interaction effect where, because of the relationship between methamphetamine and gambling, we were really observing amplified harm. And the big three that we observed that was this sort of amplifying effect was having been arrested in the last month and both causing violence to others and experiencing violence as well. And so these were really the key ones that we took away where we have that interaction between methamphetamine and gambling to create amplified harm. So just starting to wrap up now and sort of talking about, well, all of that's a bit worrying perhaps, or quite interesting depending on how you look at it, but what are we going to do with it? I think philosophically for us as an organization, we're really committed to research that we do should be to the benefit of the people that we serve. There should be something actionable, something implementable, I hope that's a word, out of it that we can do to better support the people that we're privileged to support. And one of those angles that I'd like to sort of propose is thinking about, just, the sheer amount of people that we're talking about out there. That there's a lot of AOD services out there supporting a lot of people. Relatively speaking, and rightly or wrongly, there are far fewer gambling specific services out there providing that sort of support. And the whys of that is probably a story for another time, or the rightness of it is a story for another time. I would frame this more as an opportunity that if we're thinking about for those many, many AOD services, that's a lot of reach. That's a lot of scope. In essence, that's a lot of opportunity to start a conversation with people in addition to their alcohol and other drug use. Can we talk a bit about gambling as well? And in particular, can we talk about, is there any overlap between how you use substances and how you might gamble? And can we support you with that? Whether that's that we take that on, or can we link you in with another service? Whatever works, I think, ultimately. So it's really trying to broaden the opportunity to provide people with good harm minimization. If we were to think, though, about sort of common factors here, and again, like it might feel a bit overwhelming, like, great, Nick, so now you're telling me I have to be a specialist in all things. That's going to take an awful lot of training and an awful lot of time. It's probably a bit much. There's always going to be a need for specialist services, and there's always going to be unique mechanisms that need to be addressed for particular things. What we'd also like to propose, though, is that there's an awful lot that's common and shared across a lot of these co-occurring conditions. And it may well be possible to do an awful lot of good by addressing those underlying factors rather than just sort of picking on those sort of presenting factors in and of themselves. And of course, to reflect our bias, one of those things that we consistently identify through our research is that impulsivity is a really shared and common mechanism across these co-occurring conditions. And so it stands to reason if we can provide support to people around helping them to be able to better manage impulsivity, to be able to respond to it more skillfully, more reflectively when it shows up, that might go a long way toward providing them with better tools, better skills to be able to minimize the harms that they might otherwise experience when they're experiencing those strong emotional states and have those really strong urges and impulses that might go with them. So just to briefly summarize and bring everything together that we've discussed, the harms that people can experience around gambling are significant in and of themselves, but they can be particularly elevated where there's stimulant use and what we've observed, particularly where methamphetamine use is involved in the picture. So for us, the call out to the workforce is, in essence, if you work in an AOD service, you should be alert to gambling harm. If you work in a gambling service, you should probably be alert to alcohol and other drug-related harm, and particularly how those things come together. That common ground across this around negative emotional states, talking depression and anxiety, things of that nature, but particularly the impulsivity with which people respond to those states seems to be a really core commonality across these co-occurring conditions and could be a very wise target for treatment. I think that's just about everything I've got for us this morning. So hopefully that's been informative and useful. And yeah, very happy to have a chat and take some questions.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Nick. That was a really interesting presentation. And the questions have been coming through fast and quickly. So we've got a few minutes now. So if you have any other questions, please put them into the Q&A box. Just to start off, there were some questions around you presented descriptives of the primary drug of concern and how that overlapped with gambling. And did you look at polysubstance use at all, or was that out of scope?
My colleague Georgia Delosa is doing her PhD on that space, and she was one of the collaborators on this work. In the fullness of time, I imagine she will have a tremendously sophisticated body of work that will emerge from that. For the time being, we did keep this rather simple by contrast.
Yeah, fair enough. It can be quite tricky to pick apart when you're looking at polysubstance use. Also with that table, like how did you categorize tobacco? Was that also considered a stimulant? What did that look like?
That's a good question. To be honest, I didn't look too closely at that just because the base rate of it being a primary drug of concern for people coming through our services is quite low, relatively speaking. And it's generally not a major focus of the work that we do relative to other substances. At the core of it, though, I probably would class it as a stimulant. I think tobacco's just a bit like nominally it is a stimulant, but I think the way it presents is quite different from, cocaine, methamphetamine, so those other classes of substances, not least, the legality or otherwise of these different sort of substance types here.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess also kind of relatedly, when you looked at all your fancy maths and modeling, did you take into account whether like alcohol or how alcohol might impact the relationship between methamphetamine and gambling, or did you just look at methamphetamine and gambling?
Yeah, like I mentioned, for this, we did keep it fairly simple. I think just in the interests of brevity, as much as anything. Like I mentioned, Georgia will be doing a much, much deeper dive into some of those interactions and that sort of, more sophisticated level of analysis. This was more our sort of dipping a toe in those waters.
Yeah, and you've got to start somewhere. Once you start adding in covariates, sometimes where do you stop? But I
Hmm.
guess because alcohol is often so commonly used along with methamphetamine and gambling, it'd be really interesting to see. And hopefully Georgia can, yeah, provide
Yeah.
some great answers around that.
And I think those interactions will be hugely important for us to observe because, like I mentioned, like as a primary substance, at least to a degree, it almost is kind of like the reverse holds in a way. Um, I don't imagine that's always the case by any means. I imagine in reality, how it interacts with other things is going to be quite complex indeed.
Yeah, yeah. So you kind of wrapped up talking about how we need to better support people to manage impulsivity and respond to it. And so I guess I was thinking we have evidence-based harm reduction practices for people who use methamphetamine. Are there sort of harm reduction practices in gambling that we might be able to consider or apply when talking to clients?
I imagine there certainly would be. Um,
Sorry,
Yeah,
that's
no,
probably a
again,
really
I
big
think it's sort of
question.
like thinking about like a lot of the tools that we use, broadly speaking, in therapy, counseling, call it what you will, tend to show up here and there. Like if you think something like as core as CBT, a lot of the things that we'll use for one presentation are going to be very similar to another presentation. Probably the main degree of difference will be how it's formulated, how it's conceptualized, and how, as much as anything, how we meaningfully convey that to the person that we're working with so that it makes sense, so that it comes together and is useful to them, and so that they can apply the skills when they need them. Why are we focused on impulsivity as that sort of common factor? Is that again that sort of phenomenon for if you've worked with someone who's sort of like multiple co-occurring things can be like, well, we really got their alcohol use down, shame their gambling shot through the roof, or vice versa, or this, that, or the other. In a way, sometimes when we're sort of moving one lever, another sort of lever compensates because we're not necessarily addressing the underlying driver that's common to those things. So while there is a need to sort of, of course, we need to provide harm min skills around gambling, around AOD, whatever the particular need might be. In addition to that, we might also want to think about, what is shared across these, and can we start to have a conversation about that and start to target tools that might address that as well.
Yeah, and I think this kind of also ties into someone's question around if there's something, if there's an issue that should be targeted first in the counselling, whether that be should you target the gambling first or should you target the AOD? But it feels like really it's thinking around if you have both of those, what's the common sort of underlying area that needs to be?
Yeah. I mean, look, you could probably make very reasonable arguments in several directions there. To my mind, I'd be thinking about, as much as anything, what does the client perceive as most important to them at that time? Perhaps also where are they experiencing the most harm at this particular point in time? Like if their gambling's not a major concern, but there's a lot going on with the AOD, or vice versa, that might naturally tilt me towards addressing where they're experiencing the most harm. But yeah, I think, as I said, more often than not, where you find one, you find the other, and they often sort of the tide rises at the same time with both of those things. So while we do sort of want to be trying to address the both as much as we can, sometimes that's by way of looking at what do they share.
Yeah, great. And I guess in terms of treatment in your work, in terms of reducing or ceasing methamphetamine use, are there some interventions that seem to work better than others? I know that we recently had a Cracks in the Ice webinar looking at sort of new and emerging treatments, but on the ground in your practice, what do you see?
I think it ultimately depends on the person, where they're at, what their recovery goals are, whether they're looking to cease using completely or whether they're just ceasing, wanting to minimize the harm that they might be experiencing around that. I think I can only speak for us as an organization. We're very fortunate to have, I guess, a continuum of care that ranges from, community counseling through to a more comprehensive, like, day program where people can sort of have a very intensive treatment mode, but still go home at the end of the day. We can offer, ambulatory detox, or for that matter, residential detox in some instances. And of course, we also are able to offer like a 6 to 12 week residential program for people who are wanting that, really sort of more intensive and wraparound support. I think to a large degree, it's really driven by the person, their needs at the time, the complexities at the time, and of course, what they view as most important to them.
Yeah, great. I love that client-centered approach. I'm just looking over the questions quickly, and there's some questions around going back to you said that heroin was a bit of an outlier, and you're still thinking about why that might have popped up. Um, what did you see sort of for the other sedatives? Do you have like a hypothesis or anything around what you saw, why that might happen?
To level with you, not particularly. I've not yet had too much time to put some thought into that. I think at a glance, though, and again, probably where this might get more complicated as we start to look at a a polysubstance level as a more sophisticated statistical model. This that that table we looked at was very much primary drug of concern. I mean, right off the bat, the base rates for a lot of those substances are just really quite low. You know, whereas we're very aware that polysubstance is so common for the people that we're supporting. So that's kind of a bit hidden in that picture there. I think given that it is sort of framing it around that more sort of not necessarily mono drug presentation, if you will, but if that is the case, that might be something in itself that if people are using more depressant type substances, maybe that's a little bit contraindicated, might be a bit too strong, but it seems to, sort of an opposite direction with gambling. Why that exception to the rule there with heroin? I said that's truly a mystery unto me. I'd be interested to sort of put some more thought into it in the fullness of time. For now, it remains a mystery.
Yeah, with all our free time, right, Nick?
Yeah,
I
we'll
guess
get
one
to it.
thing when you were talking, I was thinking, I wonder if it's also around the population of people who might be using drugs, because as you were talking about homelessness, and I forget the other two factors that you brought up as well, like it potentially maybe it's around the culture, like the who
Mm.
is actually using the drug, and that kind of wider context as well.
Yeah, I imagine there's definitely, an explanation to be had in there that would help it make an awful lot more sense. Just from what we've done so far, it's an interesting finding that is sort of in us, in need of an explanation.
Yes, yes. Um, I guess one other question. There's a lot of, I feel like a lot of people are really interested in all the different drugs as well. So there's just one around cocaine. But it sounds like that may be part of George's project coming up is to look into more depth all the other
Yeah.
drugs.
Um, Again, like we said, like we could observe, cocaine as a primary substance of concern is considerably less common, not unheard of for our service by any means, but the big two, or in essence, the big three for us as primary drug of concern is methamphetamine, alcohol, and then kind of in a distant third after a fashion is cannabis. Well, I say polysubstance use is much more the norm than the exception for us as well. So yeah, I'm really sort of looking forward and keen to collaborate on the work that George will be doing while we'll be able to sort of delve into that in a bit more detail.
Yeah, great. And have you done any research on methamphetamine and gambling connection among Aboriginal or First Nations communities?
I have to say that was not a focus of this particular piece of work. We do collect, I say we collect a lot of data. We do all that we can to accurately record people's Aboriginality. Of course, naturally, we want to be particularly sensitive when we're engaging in any sort of analysis around that so that we're proceeding in a very ethical manner. Hence why we didn't just want to sort of dive into that, recklessly, I suppose.
Yeah, fair enough. I guess one thing that's definitely coming out through the Q&A and the chat is that people are really fascinated in this research, Nick, and they're really excited to see more of it and really in depth and work out all the relationships. Um, Ideally, if you had all the time in the world, what do you think your next directions might be?
That's one heck of a question.
Well, if you could
Yeah.
answer, I guess, one question, sort
Hmm.
of go down one more
Yeah.
one rabbit hole, what would you
Oh,
pick?
for sure. I think one of the things that I do have an answer to that. For me, I'd like to get a clearer picture of, in essence, what it actually looks like. And I
Hmm.
think, this was clearly a very quantitatively driven piece of work. Assuming I could do all the ethics and all that in the snap of a finger, doing something considerably more qualitative, I think would be really important to understand, what this actually looks like for people, what sort of gambling products, if you will, people are engaged in, at what times are they using them, what are the particular harms they might be experiencing. And again, all of that with the view towards how can we better support people to stay, well.
Yeah, okay, great. Well, I think that's probably all that we have time for. There's just one last question. Why do both methamphetamine use and gambling go together so often, do you think? Do you think it really comes down to that impulsivity, or is that?
I think, there's definitely sort of common factors there that, methamphetamine provides an awful lot of energy. It makes people sort of very reward driven, very, activity driven. Gambling operates in many ways on very similar mechanisms. And naturally, I think, the two are, dare we say, kind of good friends to each other in, unfortunately, perhaps the worst way possible.
Those good friends that our parents didn't like, right?
Hmm.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. We've had so many questions and comments about what a fantastic presentation it's been and how informative it's been, Nick. So thank you so much for your time,
My
and
pleasure.
really looking forward to hearing more about where this research goes and the next steps. Thank you, everyone who attended today's webinar. Apologies if you didn't get your question answered. You're more than welcome to get in touch with us via email. And just to say that we'll be holding more webinars and putting new resources on Cracks in the Ice throughout the year. So feel free to stay up to date by subscribing to our mailing list via cracksontheice.org.au. So thank you again, Nick, and thank you, everyone. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thanks.